with our curriculum committee. We're hoping more people. So I'm going to call the meeting to order. And just answer present, please. Joanne Adams here. Jamie Bowling
Here.
Hugh Dolan here. Patrice McCrary. I am here. Joanna Stevens here. Randy Poe. Right here, Randy. Randy Poe. Right here. Randy Poe is here. All right.
Thank you.
We have one big order of business today. So first we're going to have a report from the Portrait of a Learner Graduate Subcommittee. So that was headed up by Dr. Poe. So we are ready for you to report on that work.
Meredith, thank you. Appreciate you keeping me on target. So first of all, I just want to say thank you to subcommittee members and also for all the KBE members that worked on this. I know that David and Kelly's department and Vicky's and all that had a lot of work behind the scenes. So, you know, what you're seeing is a lot of work from different people that led up to this. So for those that missed our or did see our last session, I think I'm talking to most of the people that were there. But these are the proposed disposition and skills. I think from the last time, it's the last bullet point you're seeing there, that critical communicator. This is what we had was we added the creative contributor, and this was brought on from the last board meeting of the full board one as we had. So we sat around and we thought of ways, and KBE, this is what they came up with. And, you know, just as anything, this is a recommended draft that we're doing. So in full board or anybody wants to look at this, they can add to it going forward, because even though we're proposing this, it's still a work progress moving forward from our subcommittee to the full committee, which is basically what we're in the subcommittee of the full committee, I guess, here that's working. So some of you have not seen this. So, you know, take a second to read over that. And we can discuss that a little bit if anybody's got any questions about it, because this was added in our last subcommittee meeting. I guess people be watching online, so should I be reading this?
So in the portal, they want you the full description.
Okay, so they can see it. I always get upset when people read slides. So there it is.
You know, I'm really glad that we added the creative contributor, especially after we heard today, like those 1,000 responses and how overwhelming like the creativity part was in those responses that were kind of like validating that.
Right. From our discussion there, we had discussion whether to make this a separate one or to combine that with some of the other ones. And, you know, and I would say at the beginning myself, I was wondering, can we combine these in? But, you know, after reading this and reading this several times last night over again, I appreciated that we kept it separate in relationship to the fact that Dr. Todd and myself were having a conversation before this board meeting started today in relationship of how you can take one area and then create that in another. And we were talking about examples of different students, and this really came to light to me since the last time that we actually had a meeting about how we can take our existing experiences and shape those. I was using the example of Dr. Todd before the meeting started. My son, who's a computer engineer degree from UK, went to his manufacturing trade show in Chicago, And what he saw there, he came back and decided he was going to be working on his master's degree in electrical engineering. And he said, you know, I know how to put all these things together. I know how they all work. They did all these things. But now what I need to do is if I really want to take my career further, I've got to be able to create. So I need more electrical along with the computer that I have. So this creative contributor, that sparked that interest in me just from that conversation with them after the fact. So that's what we have. So any questions, from the rest of the members who may not have seen this, or want to change the wording? This is your time before we present it later to the other group. Meredith's back there. She can change anything that you may need. But she's the one that was changing it on the fly the other day. Thoughts?
As an urban health person, I love the word play, the word play with, when it goes play with the possibility. Curiosity, and I love that phrase. At first I thought, this is interesting.
I know.
Play of words, pardon that. But the more I read it, the more I feel really good now.
Well, that's the word that I read multiple times last night. I said, do I really like this or not? But then, and I was trying to substitute words in there. We don't want tinker with it, because tinker means that we're just modifying. So the place means that, and this is where we also had that discussion with the elementary, to be honest, because I was questioning, how do we take them down to the elementary? And, because as we heard from Dr. Mullins today, it's about success. It's not about the graduate. So ours is about learning. The question was is, how do we get our kids to be creative? I go back to Phil Select's work. It's about engagement, not ritual compliance, and allowing students to create experiences and play with the possibility is really what we want them to do. We don't want to give them a sheet that's got 10 steps on it. Go build this. We want to give them a blank slate and let them play around, let them create. So, yeah, I went back and forth on that constantly. So, any other thoughts? Because I think we have to probably, from our committee, because of the subcommittee, approve this, but do we need to approve this ourselves?
At the subcommittee, so that then we can to
So yeah, I should have read the script that Stacy gave me. That at this time, then, if you saw that, we would entertain a motion to approve the proposed state level portrait of a learner.
Do we have a motion? All right. Is there a second? All in favor? Opposed?
Aye.
All right. In addition to finalizing the recommended portrait, the subcommittee discussed a proposed implementation plan. So we have Donnie Tran, partner from the Center for Innovation and Education, and he'll provide an overview of the proposed plan.
Hi, good afternoon, members of the curriculum committee. It's a pleasure to be here with you today virtually. And I'm just want to say first, thank you to Dr. Poe and the other members of the subcommittee for their work and time to do the work necessary to put together some thoughts on implementation of the portrait of a learner that you just moved forward. The approach that we took to develop this list was really centered on this idea of listening to community members and listening to the people who would have to do this work in the field and getting their insights about how best to implement the portrait of a learner. And so what we asked all of the subcommittee members to do was to go and conduct an empathy interview with somebody in their network. And members of the subcommittee interviewed teachers, family members, students, administrators, district leaders, and community members that they knew, and asked them questions around what an effective implementation of this might look like. And we came back together and we pulled out some key ideas from that and insights that were derived from those interviews. And we started to find patterns about what kind of implementation would be most supportive in bringing this portrait of a learner alive. And that's the summary here is the synthesis of that. And so this is really not only the work of the subcommittee, who did a tremendous amount of lift to make this happen, but really represents the voice of the communities across Kentucky who ultimately will need to own this work. So the first idea around implementation was to make sure that we organize local and statewide engagement with the Portrait of a Learner, really getting into the words, the definition, to understand what does it mean, what does it look like, and then really then to support efforts to define what the state profile looks like locally and map that local context and assets to this portrait. And that will include looking at existing portrait-related work that may have been done in the community and taking that into account as well. Also, the committee recommended that we develop aligned teacher and leadership profiles that describe the different ways of leading that are necessary to advance the student portrait. Because we came to the realization that defining what students will do is very important, but what kind of teaching and what kind of leadership is required to make this portrait really possible in the lives of students? Fourth, empower and support local communities to explore different ways of implementing the portrait. These could include things like developing competency-based systems, capstone projects, graduation requirements, local accountability changes, and using the portrait to align out-of-school learning to these experiences or these competencies. And so this is recognizing that in different community contexts, different kinds of ways of implementing might be more appropriate than others, and that there may be real community interest and energy around one way of doing it in some communities and have a different energy and different emphasis in others. But even if different communities are trying different things over the next period of time, we found that it would be critical to network these communities to learn from one another and to contribute to the efforts of the Kentucky United We Learn Council. So these communities will be trying different things, but they have a lot to learn from one another. And through the work of the United We Learn Council, there's places and opportunities to synthesize what those learnings are and to help connect people who are working in similar ways. Lastly, the subcommittee wanted to encourage coherence of aligned initiatives at every level of the system. There are many, many incredible things happening with KDE support and in local communities all across the state. And there are ways in which we might bring those into greater coherence to the Portrait of a Learner and help people see how all of these initiatives are contributing to this common effort. I'm going to go on to the next slide, and then I'll stop for questions and comments. So another thing that emerged as we did this work was the last page, or the last slide, showed sort of what we might do in order to support the implementation of the Portrait of a Learner. But several themes emerged around how we wanted to do the work. No matter what sort of implementation approach was chosen by a community or by an individual unit of the school or a district, there were certain principles of implementation that kept coming up over and over again as we were listening to people in the community. First, it was really apparent that we needed to cultivate student leadership in this process and to cultivate student voice. Second, we wanted to make sure that we were always consistently building on community context and assets. Third, we wanted to recognize that taking mindset shifts really seriously would be really critical in implementing this, because there are many changes in the ways that people think about education that are embedded in adopting and implementing something like a Portrait of a Learner. Fourth, at this phase of the work, when things are so early in looking at and thinking about the elements of the portrait, we wanted to preference calibration over measuring things. When looking at something like a Portrait of a Learner, or the one that's coming from the state, or ones that are existing communities, thinking through, what does this mean? What does it look like? Do we agree that this is indicative, or this piece of student work is indicative of this particular competency. Asking questions like that, rather than trying to score it on a rubric at this phase of early implementation, that came up a number of times from different leaders throughout the system. And of course, finally, doing less is probably the right thing at this point, starting small, finding opportunities to test and try and pilot, but do so with focus and coherence came up again and again throughout the empathy interviews. So I'll pause there to answer any questions that you might have about the proposed implementation strategies or the principles that go around it.
Question I have, how do we make sure that districts that do already have something in place similar to, how do we make sure that our message is clear, that we're not asking them to change? I feel like that's something that we're going to battle a little bit. We're going to see, oh, this is the portrait, kind of like push back, and we've got to change. So how do we make sure we get that word out there?
Mm-hmm. That was a very common theme, and I appreciate that question as well. And that was why that very first thing is just organizing local and statewide engagement with the Portrait of a Learner, where that very message is really top line. That this is an opportunity to just hold up your local work next to the state model, and not in a way to compare or to stamp out, but more to just learn about how things are framed in different ways. And I think it's been fairly clear from what I've heard from members of the subcommittee that it's not the intent to have one sort of supersede the other.
Donnie, I guess, part of that discussion I think we also had was that between the differences, you have the differences because each particular county has their local board of education that determines where they're headed and what they're going. But for us, this should be talked about, I think, because that was the last recommendation from someone on the subcommittee. This should be steering our work in alignment processes with the deeper learning, the L3 work, and the others, so that those groups within the L3 know what they're working towards. And it's just not an L3 group working for innovation, but innovation in and around these particular profiles that we just created. It's not correct. One of the last points that we had added.
That's right. That element of coherence of aligned initiatives speaks exactly to that, Dr. Poe, and that this is meant to be something that provides a touchstone for communities who are engaging in this kind of ambitious work, and to allow them to see what are the hopes and aspirations of, across the state, and to give communities opportunities to sort of compare notes with each other and find out and have almost some common language by which they might be able to talk about the way in which they designed or implemented particular strategies or approaches.
Any questions for Donnie? I mean, yeah, from our opinion. All right.
Can you put back up the narrative, our proposed implementation? This is what I think we're going to be voting on now is the non-narrative implementation, so that everybody can see this is what we're voting on. And this was the last part of our subcommittee meeting is, this was the purpose of the particular work. The work was analyzing, pulling all voices together. But then our subcommittee said, okay, our work with this back to this committee. Once you vote on this, our subcommittee work is finished. And then it's back to the full committee to implement these particular steps moving forward. And that last step that we said, encourage coherence of aligned initiatives at every level of the system, so that as we're moving forward, whether KBE is talking about this, or KBE is talking about this, or L3 is talking about this, that it's going down that particular path. So when we are talking about United We Learn, terms, correct, United We Learn, we know that we're talking about these portraits of success ultimately through whatever competency-based or capstone projects or alignment of different graduation requirements. They all should be supporting that particular implementation of that work back to the learners that of success that we just voted on. That's what we're voting on, just so that you know. This to me was not hard to follow, but the particular steps that from where we were to where we are now. And this turns it back over. This is basically turning it back over to this full committee now. So when you vote on this, we'll all have a stake.
So at this time, I would ask the committee to entertain a motion to approve the proposed implementation plan. Is there a motion? Joanne? A second? Patrice? All those any discussion? All those in favor, say aye.
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 All right, then thank you very much. So now we need a motion to adjourn our committee.
And so,
Second.
Second.
Thank you, Jamie. And all in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. So, we'll return to the full board.